Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. December 19th, 1959. A quiet morning in Osprey, Florida turned into a nightmare when Christine Walker's brother made a devastating discovery. Inside a modest ranch-style house, he found the bodies of Cliff and Christine Walker, along with their two young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and baby Debbie. All four had been shot execution style. The murders bore a striking resemblance to another infamous case, the Clutter family killings in Kansas, immortalized in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The perpetrators of that crime, Perry Smith and Richard Hickock, were known to be in Florida at the time. But was there really a connection, or did something more sinister and local play a role in this family's tragic end? Tonight, we'll dive deep into one of Florida's most haunting cold cases, the Walker family murders. Let's begin. The quiet town of Osprey, Florida, was forever changed on that crisp December morning in 1959. The kind of morning where the sun sparkled off the dew-covered grass, and families were busy preparing for the upcoming Christmas holidays. No one could have predicted the horror that would be discovered at the Walker family home, a modest ranch-style house on a peaceful stretch of road. Cliff Walker, 25, and his wife Christine, 24, were well-liked members of the community. They had two beautiful children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. Cliff worked as a ranch hand and was known for his strong work ethic and gentle demeanor. Christine was a devoted mother who kept an immaculate home and was always ready with a kind word for neighbors. On December 19th, 1959, Christine's brother came to the Walker residence after the family failed to show up at a planned gathering. What he discovered would haunt the community for generations to come. Inside the home, he found all four family members brutally murdered. Each had been shot at close range with a .22 caliber weapon. The crime scene told a horrific story. Cliff Walker was found in the hallway, face down, having been shot in the head. Christine's body was discovered in the bedroom, where evidence suggested she had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. Little Jimmy was found in the hallway near his father, while baby Debbie was in her crib, both children shot execution style. Detective Harold Lovell, one of the first officers on the scene, would later recall, "In all my years of law enforcement, I had never seen anything like it. The brutality, the senselessness, and those poor children." The crime scene photographs, which still exist in the case files today, show a home that otherwise appeared normal. Christmas presents were wrapped and waiting under a small tree, dishes were neatly stacked in the kitchen sink, and family photos smiled down from the walls. The investigation revealed that the Walkers had been seen earlier that day at a Chevrolet dealership in Sarasota, where they had gone to purchase a new car. Several witnesses remembered seeing them there, including a salesman who described them as a happy young family, excited about their potential purchase. They left the dealership around 3 p.m., presumably heading home. What happened in the hours that followed has remained one of Florida's most perplexing mysteries. The timing of the murders would later prove significant. Just weeks earlier, on November 15th, 1959, another family had been brutally murdered in Holcomb, Kansas. The Clutter family, Herb, Bonnie, and their teenage children Nancy and Kenyon, were killed in their farmhouse by Perry Smith and Richard Hickock. The similarities between the two cases were striking. Both involved the murder of an entire family. Both occurred in rural settings, and both seemed to lack clear motives. What made the connection even more intriguing was that Smith and Hickock had fled to Florida after the Clutter murders. Gas station receipts and witness statements would later confirm their presence in the Sunshine State during December 1959. They had been driving a 1949 Chevrolet that they had stolen in Iowa, and investigators would later discover they had visited multiple car dealerships in Florida, possibly casing potential victims. The local sheriff's department worked tirelessly on the case, following every lead that came their way. They interviewed hundreds of people, including neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen something suspicious that day. One neighbor reported hearing what she thought were gunshots around dusk, but had dismissed them as hunters in the nearby woods, a common occurrence in rural Florida. The murder weapon was never found, though shell casings recovered at the scene confirmed it was a .22 caliber firearm. Investigators also found distinct boot prints in the soft soil outside the house, and tire tracks that suggested the killer or killers had parked behind the home, hidden from the main road. Christine's assault provided crucial DNA evidence, but in 1959, such forensic techniques were decades away from being useful. The evidence was preserved, however, and would later be tested as DNA technology advanced. The results would add another layer of complexity to the investigation, but we'll get to that later. The local papers covered the story extensively. The Sarasota Herald-Tribune's headline on December 21, 1959 read, "Young family slaughtered in home, no suspects." The article described the shock and fear that had gripped the community. Local residents began locking their doors, something many had never done before. Parents kept their children closer, and a general sense of unease settled over Osprey like a heavy fog. The possible connection to Smith and Hickock wasn't immediately apparent. It wasn't until Truman Capote's In Cold Blood was published years later that investigators began to seriously consider the possibility. The book detailed Smith and Hickock's crime spree following the Clutter murders, including their time in Florida. When interviewed in prison years later, both Smith and Hickock denied any involvement in the Walker murders. However, their statements were inconsistent, and both men were known to be pathological liars. Hickock, in particular, gave conflicting accounts of their whereabouts on December 19, 1959. The investigation would take many turns over the years, with numerous potential suspects being considered and eliminated. Some investigators believed the murders were connected to local criminal elements, possibly related to cattle rustling, which was a serious problem in Florida at the time. Others suspected a personal vendetta against Cliff Walker, though no one could identify any enemies the well-liked ranch hand might have had. The case would become one of Florida's most enduring mysteries, spawning countless theories and investigations over the decades. Each new generation of detectives would take their turn at trying to solve it, armed with new technologies and investigative techniques. But the truth about what happened to the Walker family that December day would prove elusive. As the investigation continued into the 1960s, detectives began to piece together more details about the Walkers' final day. A thorough review of the Chevrolet dealership's records showed that Cliff Walker had been particularly interested in a 1956 Bel Air and had even begun preliminary paperwork. This mundane detail would later take on new significance when investigators learned that Smith and Hickock had a pattern of targeting people at car dealerships. John Speicher, the car salesman who had helped the Walkers that day, provided valuable information during subsequent interviews. Mrs. Walker was holding little Debbie while Jimmy was running around looking at all the shiny cars, he recalled. Mr. Walker mentioned they'd been saving for months for a down payment. They were just like any other young family looking to better themselves. In 1960, Detective Hugh McMillan discovered something intriguing. A waitress at a diner just 3 miles from the Walker home reported serving 2 men matching Smith and Hickock's descriptions on what might have been the day of the murders. She remembered them because they had been unusually nervous and had asked detailed questions about the area. However, like many potential leads in the case, this one couldn't be definitively confirmed. The investigation took an interesting turn in 1962 when a former cellmate of Richard Hickock came forward with information. According to this source, Hickock had mentioned taking care of a family in Florida during one of their conversations. When pressed for details, however, the informant's story began to show inconsistencies, and investigators ultimately deemed him unreliable. In 1965, shortly before their executions for the Clutter murders, both Smith and Hickock were subjected to polygraph examinations regarding the Walker case. The results were inconclusive for Smith, while Hickock suggested deception on key questions. However, polygraph technology of the era was far from reliable, and the results couldn't be considered definitive evidence. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was analysed in 1987 when investigators discovered archived palm prints from the Walker crime scene. These prints were compared to those of Smith and Hickock, but no match was found. However, experts noted that the quality of the preserved prints was poor, making definitive exclusion impossible. Christine Walker's brother, who had discovered the bodies, continued to work with investigators over the years. In a 1990 interview, he recalled, "Christine had mentioned seeing a strange car driving past the house several times in the week before the murders. She didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back..." His voice had trailed off, the weight of 30 years of unanswered questions evident in his expression. The case took another turn in 2012 when advanced DNA testing was performed on preserved evidence from Christine Walker's assault. The results excluded Smith and Hickock as suspects, seemingly ending decades of speculation about their involvement. However, some investigators argued that the degradation of the evidence over time made these results unreliable. Detective Kyle Robinson, who inherited the case files in 2007, noted, "The DNA results don't tell the whole story. Smith and Hickock could have had an accomplice, or there could have been multiple perpetrators. The physical evidence doesn't rule out their involvement entirely, it just suggests they weren't directly responsible for the sexual assault." The investigation also revealed interesting parallels between the Walker murders and other unsolved cases from the same period. Between 1959 and 1960, there were 3 other family annihilations in the southeastern United States, though none matched the exact pattern of the Walker case. Some investigators believed these could be connected, suggesting the possibility of a serial killer operating in the region. In 2019, 60 years after the murders, the Sarasota Sheriff's Office released previously unseen crime scene photographs and witness statements, hoping to generate new leads. These included detailed images of boot prints found outside the Walker home, which forensic experts believe came from a size 11 work boot, likely a brand popular among agricultural workers in the late 1950s. The photographs also revealed something that hadn't been previously disclosed: a small piece of paper found in Cliff Walker's pocket with a phone number written on it. The number led to a disconnected line in Miami, but modern investigators were able to trace it to a business that had operated there in 1959, a livestock auction house. This discovery lent credence to theories about possible connections to cattle rustling. One of the most haunting aspects of the case emerged from interviews with surviving neighbors. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, who lived half a mile from the Walkers in 1959, recalled hearing Debbie Walker crying in the early evening hours of December 19th. "It wasn't unusual to hear children crying, of course," she said in a 2015 interview. "But this was different. It was the kind of crying that makes a mother's heart stop. I've carried that sound with me all these years." The case files also contained an interesting detail about Christine Walker's last known actions. The position of items in the kitchen suggested she had been preparing dinner when the intruder or intruders entered the home. A pot of beef stew was found on the stove, completely burned dry. This detail helped investigators narrow down the time of the attacks to between 4:30 and 6 p.m. The question of why the Walkers were targeted has plagued investigators for decades. If Smith and Hickock weren't responsible, who was? And why choose this particular family? The Walkers weren't wealthy, didn't have enemies, and lived in a relatively remote location. These questions have led some investigators to suspect that the family may have witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. The possibility that the Walkers had witnessed something sinister gained traction in 2020 when retired detective James Malone discovered old records indicating that Cliff Walker had been scheduled to testify in a local cattle rustling case. The court documents, found in a misfiled archive box, showed that Walker had agreed to appear as a witness just 3 weeks before his murder. However, the names of the defendants in that case had been lost to time, the records damaged by decades of improper storage. Local historian Margaret Stevenson, who has studied the case extensively, points out that cattle rustling in 1950s Florida was far more serious than many people realize. "We're not talking about teenagers stealing a cow or two," she explains. "This was organized crime. Millions of dollars worth of cattle were being stolen and moved across state lines. People got killed over it." In 2021, a deathbed confession by former ranch hand Thomas Buck Whitaker added another layer to the mystery. Whitaker, who had worked at a neighboring ranch in 1959, claimed he had overheard Cliff Walker arguing with two men about missing cattle several days before the murders. While Whitaker's advanced age and failing health made some details of his account questionable, investigators found his timeline consistent with other established facts. The cattle rustling angle gained further credibility when investigators discovered that 3 other murders in Florida between 1957 and 1960 had connections to ranch workers who had reportedly witnessed suspicious cattle movements. None of these cases were ever solved, and any potential links to the Walker murders remained circumstantial. A breakthrough of sorts came in 2022 when forensic analysts, using advanced photographic enhancement techniques, were able to better examine the boot prints found at the scene. The new analysis revealed a distinctive wear pattern suggesting the killer had a slight limp favoring their right leg. This detail matched neither Smith nor Hickock, but interestingly corresponded with descriptions of a known cattle rustler from the era, Raymond Limping Ray McCall. However, McCall had died in 1963 without ever being questioned about the Walker case. The enhanced crime scene photographs also revealed another detail that had been overlooked: a partial tire track showing an unusual repair to the tire's tread. This distinctive pattern was consistent with a type of tire repair commonly used by rural mechanics in the late 1950s, suggesting the killer may have been local to the area rather than passing through like Smith and Hickock. Christine Walker's personal diary, discovered in 2023 during a renovation of her sister's home, provided additional context to the family's final weeks. In an entry dated December 12, 1959, she wrote, "Cliff seems worried about something at work. He won't talk about it, but I know something's wrong. He's been checking the locks twice before bed." This entry suggests the family may have had reason to fear for their safety before the murders. The diary also revealed that Christine had noticed a black sedan parked near their home several times in the weeks before the murders. She had written down a partial license plate number, but unfortunately, Florida's vehicle registration records from that period were destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1971. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case emerged from a letter found in Cliff Walker's work jacket, a Christmas card he had written but never mailed to his parents. Inside was a photo of the family taken just days before their deaths, showing them decorating their Christmas tree. The image captures a moment of pure joy, making the tragedy that followed even more poignant. The case remains active today, with new investigators periodically reviewing the evidence using modern techniques. While the DNA evidence may have excluded Smith and Hickock from direct involvement in Christine's assault, many questions remain unanswered. Was the Walker family murdered because Cliff had witnessed something he shouldn't have? Were there multiple perpetrators? Did the killers have local connections that helped them evade justice? As we approach the 65th anniversary of this tragic event, the Walker family murders continue to haunt Florida's criminal history. The case represents not just an unsolved mystery, but a reminder of how a single act of violence can forever change a community. The small town of Osprey would never be quite the same after that December day in 1959. The Christmas presents the Walkers had bought for their children remained wrapped under their tree, never to be opened. Today, these presents are preserved in the evidence storage facility, silent testimonies to the lives cut tragically short. They serve as a powerful reminder to investigators that somewhere, someone knows the truth about what happened to this young family. Until that truth comes to light, the Walker family murders will remain one of Florida's most enduring mysteries, a case that continues to challenge investigators and haunt all who encounter it. As one detective recently noted, some cases get under your skin and stay there. The Walker family murders, that's one of those cases. Those 4 souls deserve justice, and we'll keep looking until we find it.